in the early part of my professional life, basically my early adult life, I was a music student at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I was studying voice with John Payton. I was very lucky to have him because he was probably um, the only instructor on the voice faculty that would allow their students to sing anything other than bel canto singing. Um, and he didn't he preferred that I do, you know, opera arias and art song when I'm studying with him, but he did not mind that after hours I was going and playing in clubs and singing and other styles of music. There were people on the faculty that would have dropped you as a student if they found out that you were doing that. So I went through music school singing, you know, this classical music, mostly like common practice period, and opera arias and art song and so forth. And at the same time playing like sort of singer-songwriter, like kind of rock music and folk rock. I had a radio program on the local NPR affiliate, which was KGNU in Boulder. And I feel like I got my sort of contemporary music and experimental music education from the stacks of that radio station. And I was doing this freeform radio program where I was just playing works by all manner of contemporary music, avant-garde music, experimental music across all different genres. And so I would be segueing from, you know, Varese and Stockhausen into like, you know, the Ramones, Brian Eno, or, you know, and so I became enamored of contemporary music, and I really wanted to veer more in that direction and do things that were more avant-garde than what I was doing. But I was having a hard time finding that. And I tried in my songwriting to just write things that were more experimental, and it just ended up sounding like quirky versions of what I was already doing. And then at one point, I was exposed to someone using a digital delay. Um, and it happened to be the bassist, Jaco Pastorius, who used to be the bassist of a group called Weather Report. And at a concert, the best of the band left the stage, and he sat down and started doing a duet with himself by looping his bass into this digital delay. And I was just so taken by that. I was like, how is he doing that? And, you know, so I went to a music store the next day. I described it to the guy, and he was just like, oh, that's a digital delay, but you don't want the one that Jaco was probably using because that's really low. It's a foot pedal one. It's a really low sampling rate, and it's not going to sound great on your voice. So he sold me a rack mountable digital delay unit. And I always tell people I went home, and my poor neighbors, I never went to bed that night. I just was amazed at what can happen when you can loop and layer your voice. And so I feel like that was a very specific moment in time where I actually found my voice as an artist. Because as soon as I started working with the delay, I of course had to run out and buy a bunch of more delays and build sort of a rig that was made from like a whole stack of digital delay units, and multi-effects processors and so on and so forth. But the thing that was specific about that situation was that I began to listen differently. I began to construct work differently. I became aware of other elements being important besides melody and harmony and rhythm. I was much more interested now in timbre and in texture, and I became aware of like structures that had to do with repetition and slowly changing processes. And I also became really aware of how musical the sound of spoken, speech sounds can be because of all the melodic and rhythmic material that is embedded in the speech sound. And so I So I just started composing completely differently. And I basically jettisoned everything I had been doing before that and just started a whole brand new way of working. I don't prefer one or the other. I'm just but they are different, and I like it that they're different. I think it makes life more interesting that I have these different approaches. And then I thought it would be helpful to break down for you the different ways that I compose and the different types of work that I do. I've done all kinds of things, but the things I do regularly kind of break down into four categories. And one category would be my solo works for voice and electronics that involve, um, me singing with my gear, like processing and gesture controllers, and maybe occasionally a single channel of video being projected. And then I have these large scale performance works that are more theatrical in nature, and they involve often multiple channels of projected video. They sometimes involve other performers. They usually have a lighting design and a set design, and involve maybe some kind of movement on the stage, and maybe even props. So there's those two things. And then I also do a lot of chamber compositions these days. And this will be works that were commissioned either by an ensemble or a soloist. Um, and those pieces sometimes include a part for my own voice and electronics, and other times it's just for the ensemble. Um, and then there is uh, installation, which sometimes takes the form of just sound work that's just a stereo sound work that's just a fixed media piece that's intended to be listened to, or a multi-channel fixed media piece that is intended to be projected through an array of a lot of speakers, um, or it might be um, installation work that involves, sound and video. Um, Often sound and or video embedded in objects. And so these are kind of four different ways that I work. The other thing I often do when I'm composing work for chamber ensembles is that I tend to begin building phrases either by singing them, or listening to the text and finding melody in the text and singing that, and then transcribing what that is. But however I come about deciding the notes, the pitches and rhythms that I'm going to give to the ensemble, there is a point in time where I enter things in using a MIDI keyboard, and I put them into MIDI tracks in Pro Tools, and I sort of construct the piece there. And then I export all the MIDI out and import it into Sibelius, which is a, notation program that I use. And then I sort of work on fudging the score and cleaning it up and making it be what it's supposed to be. And then I have to work on, like, how do I express all the things that are not notes, that are not like standard notation type of ideas. How do I express those in the score and make it so that it's legible and understandable for whoever it is that's going to be performing it? So that's kind of one way that I work. If I'm making pieces that are just for my solo voice and electronics, the way that I tend to start with those is by setting up all my gear as if I was going to give a performance in my studio. Everything that I need, all of my controllers, my everything. And then I start playing and I improvise a lot. And I come up with ideas by doing. Mm-hmm. And often those things kind of almost come to me whole cloth. Like, I'll just be playing around, and then all of a sudden I'll realize, the last 5 minutes that I just did, that's a piece. And then I have to go back, and hopefully I was recording, and I have to go back and learn it. the way that I often start the process of composing a new work is to conduct a series of interviews with a large number of people who, well, you know, right, a number of people ranging from a handful to often as many as 20 or 30 people, one at a time. I bring them into my little soundproof recording booth in my studio if I can. Otherwise, I have to just find the most clean, pristine recording environment to get the interview in. And then I will record, I'll ask them a lot of questions and I'll record the interview and isolate and make what we used to call regions, or I think they now call them clips, of little speech fragments that will become part of the music. And those can be as long as full sentences or phrases. Um, but more often they're just like maybe a single word or even syllables or just phonemes. And I name them so that they're searchable for me later. So I have this bin then that is full of hundreds and hundreds of these little named clips for any given project. And they'll be named things like NM, you know, and then when I'm searching those, I can pull those up and build the music from those. And then I to start assembling these little clips into tracks in Pro Tools, and they actually kind of almost look like Legos. They're like little building blocks that, if you look at any of my Pro Tools sessions, they have these sort of bricks that are sort of spread along throughout the tracks that are layered and overlapping with each other. And that's how I actually compose the actual music, because these speech fragments actually become the music itself. So when I do these interviews, it's the answers that people give me are both inspiration for making the work, and give me ideas for making the work, but they also are the actual material that I use to make the work, literal material that I use to make the work. So the music is actually made out of the sound of these people speaking voices. And then I often build the pieces by listening to those phrases and fragments for the pitches and rhythmic figures that are embedded in them. And I sort of tease out those sounds from the sounds themselves, from the speech sounds themselves. A lot of people actually think of speech as being, a lot of people think of speech as being unpitched, but in fact, it's not, because there is no such thing as an unpitched sound, because all sounds have frequency and pitch is frequency. So if you take little passages of spoken text, you can actually find what are those pitches and what are the rhythms that are being spoken, and those could be transcribed and notated musically so that they can be played or sung by musicians. So I often find some of the material that it becomes the work through kind of transcribing the rhythms and pitches in this found text. I do think that a lot of the work that I compose is really in the realm of musique concrète, because I am using actual sounds, found sounds from the environment, or from the world around me, um, and uh, and I'm building the music, a lot of it out of those sounds. And I always like to say, especially if I'm talking to, like, giving a workshop or something like that, and I'm asking people to make a found sound or a found text piece, I always have to define what I mean by found sound and found text. So when we're talking about text, I think of found text as being text that is was not intended by the author to be art, but was actually maybe instructions for doing something, or the ingredients for something, or a method of assembling something that you bought from a store, like from the instruction manual, or you know, uh, uh, like an official notice that you may have gotten. So I take that language and it becomes the libretto, it becomes the lyrics for the work, instead of using um, a poem that was written by a poet that was intended from the very beginning to be art. And so then that just becomes like setting somebody else's poetry to music or writing my own poetry or lyrics. I sometimes do write my own poetry or lyrics, but more often the text is either found text, um, or it might be invented text. Like I might make sounds that sound lab- languagey. They sound verbal, but they're actually in like some kind of invented language or a language from another planet. Um, so, because as a singer, actually, and I think a lot of singers will relate to this, it's tricky. It's harder to sing music that has no syllables. I mean, it's hard to just sing anything other than sustained tones on just like solfege or vowel sounds. It's much easier to articulate rhythmic singing if you've got some consonants to land on, and it's more interesting, I guess, or it feels more natural and somehow communicative if there's some kind of verbal essence to the sounds. And so that's why I sometimes just start using found language because I just need something to hang the notes on, and so the language does that for me. So I'm talking about found text now, but I can also say that with found sounds, I have a similar definition, which is that found sounds to me are sounds that are when you sample or record the sounds of actual objects or events that occur in your space or outside or whatever. So it could be me dropping my keys on the concrete floor in my studio and recording that, or it could be me filling basins of uh, of water in my kitchen sink and splashing that water to get some water samples, or it could be just recording the sounds of emergency vehicles sirens as they go by, or birds that are singing outside my window, or and so then those become found sounds, as opposed to hiring a cellist or a trumpet player to come into my studio and then ask them to play scales throughout their entire range and record those sounds and then make a bank of samples of cello sounds or trumpet sounds. Those are just sampled musical instruments. Those aren't really found sounds. Um, so and I tend more to use the found sounds than I, not that I've never used samples of musical instruments, but when I use samples of my pieces, more often than not, they'll be found sounds. There's actually two different sections in baggage allowance, at least two, that directly use found language. One of the sections is a piece called Unknown Person. Did you pack your own bag, and so forth. And then I have another section in that piece where I am simply reading the little love note that the TSA leaves in your bag um, whenever they open your bag to inspect it. Or usually, I have found there have been times when it seemed like it had been opened and they didn't put the note in, but they're supposed to put this note in. And I happen to have one right here. And it says, to protect you and your fellow passengers, the Transportation Security Administration is required by law to inspect all checked baggage. As a part of this process, some bags are opened and physically inspected. Your bag was among those selected for physical inspection. The only thing I really have to say about that is that I think the biggest change has been, since that time that I wrote that piece and now, has been that we were all just in the habit of being sort of, tethered to these devices, and can be working really hard trying to finish composing a piece, and then all of a sudden, um, you hear you hear a phone vibrating, or a ringtone, or a beep, like a text message beep, or like Messenger. I used to, gosh, Facebook, it goes ding. It's like a little high pitched bell. And for years, I was, not years, but for a long time, I was just like, which one is that? What is that? I don't know which one. I don't know where to even look for this one. So it's because it could be Messenger, it could be messages, like your text message program, and it could be on the phone, or it could be on your computer. It could be WhatsApp. It might be the just alert saying that you just got an email. There's all these different alerts, and we've all got them in our ears all the time. And every time we hear them, we start patting ourselves down for our devices to see who's calling me. What should I, it doesn't matter what you're in the middle of doing. People just feel like they can't not look. And so that's what I was kind of talking about with these um, interruptions. But I would say that the big difference between then and now is that it seemed like at that point we were making a conscious choice to allow ourselves to be controlled by these things, and to allow ourselves to be dealing with screen time constantly. Whereas now we're in a world where it's our only connection to the outside world because we're locked down. And so we have to be constantly looking at screens and talking to people via screens, because there's no other way to commute. We're not allowed to be in the same room and be face to face anymore. Um, so it feels like we should get a pass. We have to be staring at these screens all day long, no matter what we're doing. Like, there isn't an activity anymore that doesn't involve the screen. There used to be, and I used to jokingly say that I have to do so many things using my computer, from writing correspondence to composing music to doing my finances. Everything I do has to get done on the computer. And I used to jokingly say that if it were possible, I would probably cook on the computer, or have meals on the computer. And then fast forward to 2020, and we're all actually having Zoom lunches and Zoom dinners. And my family actually had Thanksgiving on Zoom. So there were like 8 of us, like all my siblings and my nieces, and 8 or 10 of us were on there. We were all cooking, having eggnog, sitting down together and eating, and on Zoom. Even if you are just resigned to the fact that you're doing the work on the computer, there's still different levels of how distracted you may or may not be. So, for example, I might be trying to compose music, and I'm using the computer to do that, but um, then I have these little, in the upper right corner of the screen, I have these little notifications, um, all these little text notifications telling me I've gotten an email. And it's really hard to like just continue what you're doing and not look up there and say, oh, so and so responded to my email. I wonder what she said. And suddenly now you've switched to another application. You're reading your email now, or somebody liked my post on Facebook about my concert that I have coming up. I wonder if they're going to go. Maybe I'll check and see if they said they're going to go. And then when you try to come back, you can't just start where you left off. You have to like kind of, where was I? So sometimes you have to figure out how to turn all of that off so that you can be on this device, but be focused on the task that you're actually trying to do. You kind of have to put blinders on, as it were. It's actually kind of stressful for me right now, because I have a little problem with that 2-letter word that we're all supposed to learn. And I just don't tend to say no to things. And I thought I had gotten better at it, but I'm still like agreeing to things that I don't know why I'm agreeing to them because I'm really overcommitted. And and the other thing that's frustrating is that it seems like this COVID time, people are other people are acting like, oh, they're drumming their fingers right now, they're twiddling their thumbs because, oh, they need things. And I even have people like sending me things like, here's something fun to do if you need something to do. I'm like, I don't really understand why people think I need something to do because I'm so overwhelmed and so overcommitted that I can't and I think maybe the reason why it's gotten worse is partially because since we can't go out, people have people tended to plan way much further in advance. Even if they wanted you to come and do an interview or do a class visit at a university and or give a colloquium talk, all of those things you would get invited to do it for the following semester. They wouldn't say, "Are you busy next week?" You know, because they planned their things out more. And so it was like, and series like arts, performing arts series are booked like a year in advance at least. I would get gigs often, where they were saying, this is we're thinking about 21, 22 now, and this is, and now I get people calling me all the time saying, not calling, emailing usually, sometimes Facebook messengering, um, saying, well, we have this series. They start with a very long intro. We're doing this new series and we're trying to feature women composers, or we're talking about people who work in this and that way. And we thought you'd be perfect for that. And we're trying to do a series of them. And so the first one on the series is next month on Tuesday, the first Tuesday. And so and I'm just like, I'm booked. I'm really booked. I have a lot of things. I have a lot of commissions that I'm behind on turning in, and so it's been kind of crazy because then find myself feeling compelled to just squeeze them in, and I feel like I need to start saying no. If you want to do this in the following season, then maybe we can talk. But right now, I'm overbooked. Well, I can say that as somebody who's been doing this for many, many decades, um, people are wrong if they try to tell you that there hasn't been any change or that there's no. It's certainly not over. It's just like, people who thought, oh, racism is over because Obama was president. It's like, it's certainly not fixed. It's not done. But, oh, it is so much different, that it's so much more. Um, I can say that when I first started doing this, I would just the stereotyping of like, um, like I used to walk into when I was playing when I was playing in clubs all the time. I would walk in with my gear, and somebody who was there would see me come in and say, "Oh, you're the musician? You must do reggae." And the other thing that I would get is I would set up all of my gear myself because for years, I've been pretty much for my entire career, I've been pretty independent and doing, doing all of this stuff on my own. So I would show up at a gig and I'd set up all my gear. And after I had it all set up, some guy would come up and go, "Oh, this is cool. Who set this up for you?" Or I would go to an electronics store or a music store, and I would ask for a particular thing. I need a 1/4 inch connector that's this and this or that. And they would be, "Well, what are you going to use it for?" Which was like, basically they assumed I probably didn't know what I was doing and maybe I might be buying the wrong thing. Also, whenever I was on a compilation album of electroacoustic composers or whatever, I would generally be the only woman on it. probably the only person of color on it as well. Um, and that is simply, I mean, it's certainly still is a heavily sort of white male dominated field, the field that I'm in, but it's much less so than it used to be. And and I'm and in some cases, women have really taken the lead. Like, people who I noticed at one point that people who were doing live performance with like especially with voice and processing, um, but sometimes with other instruments and processing, that women were the leaders in that for a long time. So that was kind of that's that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I've noticed that people are much more. I mean, I think it happened for women before it happened for people of color, but like festivals, you can look at the roster of who's performing, especially like in my situation, like, so I'm on the steering committee of the San Francisco Electronic Music Festival. I was one of the founders of it. And actually the founder of it is a woman of color as well, Mia Masaoka. And we started this festival 20 years ago. Um, and Mia sort of like assembled a bunch of us and said, let's do this festival. And we put together a steering committee. Um, and we had been producing this electronic music festival for 20 years. I'm the only sort of lifer, it seems. Like all the other people, including Mia, that were on the original, founding steering committee are gone. But I'm still there, and it's a bunch of new people. But I'm proud to say that of all the electronic music festivals in the world, ours is, except for ones that are, women's festivals, or ours, I would say, has consistently been the most diverse and the most balanced, gender-wise. So if you look at the list of artists who played on the San Francisco Electronic Music Festival, you'll see just as many women there as men. But if you look at all the other electronic music festivals uh, in the world, you'll see that it's not so. It's still, I mean, they are all having some women now, but it's still, racial diversity, or cultural diversity in these things. Um, that becomes a trickier territory because because I think that people are sometimes not discriminating against a culture so much as they are discriminating against a style, a perceived style. So like they're like those things, like people see you and assume because of what you look like that you're going to make a certain type of thing, and they're like, well, that's not what we're looking for on our, whatever it is. So it can be tricky because it's hard to know where those lines fall. Um, but I can say that that it's about time that a lot of these people are suddenly getting recognition. And I do notice, and I do think that it even predates this year's sort of BLM consciousness that has somehow elevated itself to the degree that now actual people, outside of certain communities are suddenly aware that those communities exist and that they're being treated certain ways. Um, Even before that, I would say like in maybe just the few years leading up to this, I started to see a lot more consciousness in some, not all, but certain nonprofit organizations, curatorial vision started to be like, it just was interesting to me that I've been on more than one artist residency in recent years where I was one of like 5 or 6 African American people, not just even non-white people, but specifically African American people who were chosen in a group that where that in other words, that the numbers were not dwarfed completely by the numbers of people that were actually there. To the extent that I kind of noticed it, like I was like, this is weird. Like I would like come out of my studio as moving into my little residency, whatever, and one of the other fellows would come up and say and introduce themselves, and I'd say, oh hi, and then I'd go to get the first meal, and then I'd sit down next to somebody, and that person was also, and I was just like, wow, there's a lot of Black people here. And that sort of struck me because that hadn't been the case in the past. So I felt like that couldn't just be an accident. It had to be like some raising of awareness that was already happening in um, in curatorial circles, I guess. So I thought that was a good sign, that and that the people and the other part of it is that the people who were there were not all of it one, it's like they weren't like just having a token, like we need to have this, we need to have somebody representing this kind of work, because the work of all of these people was so different. My work was so completely different than these other people's works, and they were all so completely different than each other's, so that's encouraging.